Hello everyone, this is Yalda from Eat, Burn, Sleep, the online low inflammation, gut health and sustained weight loss platform. If you follow me on my social media, you probably know that I love learning, discovering new things, meeting passionate individuals. So I have decided to launch this podcast where I interview amazing people. We're going to be talking about physical health, mental health, well-being, with people who are passionate about what they do and who strive for excellence. I hope you learn from it and you enjoy it. Let's get started. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Eat, Burn, Sleep podcast. My guest today is Nick Potter, osteopath based in London, author of the book The Meaning of Pain, and has been on our podcast previously. Hi Nick, welcome back.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
So today we're going to be talking about the behavioral immune system. Nick is always full of incredible ideas, amazing discoveries. His brain works at 1,000 miles per hour, and every time I have a conversation with him, I'm like, oh my God, there are about 10 podcast topics in here. So, Nick, what is the behavioral immune system?
Well, it's a good question. It was something that I discovered actually partly, not just writing the book actually, but later on when I was looking for a reason post-pandemic as to why we were seeing in clinics so many inflamed people. And I mean by that, for example, I was contacting a shoulder group that I held a meeting with, and I said to them, guys, why have I seen 17 frozen shoulders in my clinic in 1 month when I would only ever normally see once every 4 or 6 weeks? And they all said, that's really weird, so have we, and we don't get it. And we've never really understood frozen shoulder anyway, because interestingly, it very often follows bereavement. It follows very often emotional events in your life. But more importantly, we really couldn't answer the question. We were seeing people with inflamed spines, inflamed shoulders and necks, and bowels, as you're so often dealing with, and there wasn't really an answer. So I began to look into this and happened to be listening to a lecture by an eminent neurologist who just dropped into my lap this idea of a thing called the behavioral immune system. And I thought, is that a thing? So I went and looked it up on the web. And of course, as is always the case, if you go looking for something, you find that actually it's a well-established idea. It sits in some of the neuroscientific journals where nobody ever reads because we're all too busy reading the main journals we need to read. And sadly, as ever, so much of this stuff that could be used to help people is just not getting out there. And fundamentally, believe it or not, when we were roaming the plains, when we were prehistoric Neanderthals and sapiens, we did actually recognize pandemics. They happened even then. There were viruses, of course. They're the most ancient things on the planet. And the most important thing we recognized was that when we were in the tribe, in the troop, if a stranger came to visit the troop, very often they got sick and people would start falling down. And you worked out very quickly that if you stayed away from them, obviously you didn't know about microbes and germ theory, but what you realized was if I stay away from this person, I don't seem to get sick. And so, believe it or not, over millions of years and eons of development, our brains developed a set of behavioral patterns. We know that there are set modules in the brain that we have pre-birth. They are sort of a priori mechanisms, like an operating system, if you like, on your laptop. We know how to think. We know how to respond to the world, particularly to stay safe and stay alive. And the three of these modules are fear, obviously in order to arouse a response, a stress response. Disgust, which we actually have as a set module, which is to stop us eating and playing with things that are probably toxic and could do this. So we know from the smell and taste of something that it's going to be bad for us. We learn that very quickly. And the third is avoidance. So as I've said before, if you know that somebody is sick, unwell, you learn very quickly to stay away from it. So this became hardwired into us. And that is exactly what we've seen in this pandemic. And you see it, I notice it on my train, which is my laboratory, if you like, for watching people. It's where everybody comes together in close proximity and you see their habits and so on. But what was very clear was people have been staying away from each other, not just because they were told to, but even when we now know that we're much safer, we don't need to, we're still seeing people with a kind of reflexic response, which is to move away from people even when they sniff in the carriage. You should see everybody tense and bristle. But more importantly, what I discovered was that actually, apart from this behavior pattern, it also produced an inflammatory response. which was fascinating, particularly interleukin 1b again, and interleukin 6, which is very often at the heart as a cytokine. And it produces inflammatory responses, but it also produces proteins within your immune system that are to be mobilized in case you get sick. So we produced, again, this psychoneuro response, which was perception of threat, turned it into a pattern of behaviors to protect yourself, but also mobilize the medicine chest that you need in order to protect yourself if you were to get whatever this was that was going to take you out. And we haven't left it behind. And of course, we don't have many pandemics, so we don't get as fearful of them as we did because we're not as afraid of disease as we are now, as we used to be. But in the last 100 years, with antibiotics and with immune vaccines, we haven't needed to be. But of course, it's still there. It's still in our brains from 800 years ago. So it has been fascinating to see in this post-pandemic period that people are still behaving in this. We hear that people aren't having dinner parties. They're not socializing in quite the same way. There's still this underlying fear of how to behave. And I think some people thought it was virtue posturing, but I think some of it is actually genuinely ingrained behavior patterns that we don't know we're doing, and they are like a reflex. So it will come out of us. We'll start going back to theatres and things will get better. But in the meantime, we've seen a huge increase in the number of people with inflammation.
This is really interesting. So for our listeners, I just want to clarify that inflammation is a healthy immune response to defend us against viruses, foreign pathogens. Chronic inflammation is what becomes dangerous because it's there at a low level over a long time and it starts really disrupting our immune function. So with that in mind, Nick, what you're describing here is actually a defense mechanism where our body defends itself. We recognize there is a pandemic, so we're producing cells to protect ourselves from that. If we catch it, we stay away from other people. When does it become dangerous and counterproductive?
I think this is where we're seeing so many people in the long COVID scenario. And I've been seeing a lot of people, because again, I came up with a protocol. I saw a lady last night, in fact, with a very good example of it. She's genuinely sick, and she had COVID followed, in fact, by shingles and by glandular fever because her immune system was so depleted. But what's quite interesting is that she's gone into a very extended pattern of kind of neurological behavior is the best way of looking at it, where she kind of gets foggy brain, she gets a kind of global body aching, she can't really sleep, she's agitated. And they're very non-specific symptoms, of course, and when we go looking, we don't really find anything. And this is why, again, people can get put onto the heap of being neurotic. But actually, it's a real response. But we tend to find it tends to be in people who already had a pre-existing tendency to be type A characters, worriers, control freaks. They're the people who think that their world is controllable. And as you say, we developed all the systems we needed to help us against nature because although we embrace nature, nature is also trying quite a lot of the time to take us out. So we had to develop defense mechanisms necessary. But you can get locked into them because your brain thinks that it's a continued appropriate response. So what I simply did with her, and interestingly, her background was also that unfortunately her mother lost a child just before she did. We went right back into her childhood. And I said, did you ever live with anybody in sickness? And she said, no, but my mother lost my first child. And of course, she was treated as the sickly child ever since because she was overprotected. And it's fascinating. So what's happened is anything around sickness for her is wrapped up in a high level of emotion. So she retracts, she responds and goes back home, even at 26.
Wow.
And so we discussed this last night and she could see that, and she could see that this pattern of behavior was the same and why her siblings hadn't been the same. And that actually she wasn't the sickly child. It's just that her mother wrapped her up in a cocoon of protection, which is understandable when you've lost a child. But those small tendencies have produced a high level of vigilance in her to anything to do with disease or illness. Because she can handle stress at work. It's not a problem because those things get thrown at her, but that's not a threat to her. Anything where she's learned, because her belief mechanism as a child was, children die. And it's like, well, they don't on the whole. We're lucky. But, yes, in your case, that's your experience. And it's because she was sick. And if you get sick, you die. And that's been ingrained into her. So it's helping her to park that and realize that she can live life without having to be constantly fearful of even just small illnesses. So she's locked into a stress response, which, of course, is maintaining the inflammatory response. Yeah. And her brain sabotages her by giving her fatigue. And so every time she does something that is going to stretch her too much, she either gets brain fog or goes into fatigue.
Which are typical signs of chronic inflammation, because you get neuroinflammation as well.
Exactly.
So basically, your body starts producing inflammatory cells at times of pandemic. That's ancestral. But then if you have emotional issues, or you're the type A, as you say, quite controlling, in a time where you can't really control the elements around you, you keep this response going, and then that turns really in a chronic state, systemic and dangerous.
Completely correct. I think also, I mean, this is sort of hypothetical from my point of view, but certainly in my experience with some patients, is that we build a set of ideals around the fact that we think we have greater control over the world than we really do. And of course, it's really just because we're living in a really safe world. I mean, we're living safer, happier lives than we've actually ever lived on the planet ever, but we don't really ever appreciate it. And we're constantly being told, of course, in order to sell us things, that actually the world's a really dangerous place and you need to be careful. And I think that we set up that our little rituals, the things we do every day, our control freakery in a sense, is what protects us, and it isn't. And then when, of course, the nature does take you out, or something takes you out, you are completely deflated by the fact that you thought, but I thought I had the world sorted, and it didn't work. And it sends them into crisis. How do I build back up any degree of confidence in that anything I can do will keep me safe?
What you're saying, I think, is going to resonate with so many people, because it's very true. We have huge egos, and we think that our little rituals is what produces this safety. We think we're in control of that. But you're absolutely right. If you look at history, we have some of the lowest mortality rates, the highest rates of access to education, the highest rates of access to food, and we keep painting a grim picture, but actually we've never done so well. So when the pandemic happened, I remember actually doing a little video on Instagram where I said, this is actually completely normal and expected. In fact, we hadn't gone through a war in Europe and in the US for so long, nor a pandemic. We were having, if you look at charts and trends, the up was going on for too long.
Exactly. We got too comfortable, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
One of the problems of peacetime is that you lose, and of course, if you've never had contextual fear, so a lot of our children are oversensitive to things happening because, of course, they've had no contextual fear to gauge by which on the fearometer, if you like. So if a child's had a childhood sickness, like God forbid it should be a tumour or something potentially life-threatening, it's amazing how when you meet them as adults, how resilient they are.
Yeah.
Because they literally, the bar by which they set everything else is like, well, it's a lot better than being dead. And you go, yeah, okay, I get that. You think, wow, what a great response. And so that's the bar by which. So I'm actually involved in a school at the moment about talking to teachers about a whole new cultural change in how we look at educating kids and making them deliberately face dangers. They're obviously safe ones and small groups, but saying that actually bringing children up, and I would hope that the parents do the same thing, is that it's not about protecting your child, but giving them the skills they need to face whatever might be thrown at them. Because you're never going to be able to protect your child completely. So if you're sitting by a river and your child keeps going away, stop grabbing them and pulling back, teach them to swim.
Yeah.
Because the chances are your child will go in the river one day. And the best thing you can do to give them a chance is teach them to swim. And so it's what I call graded exposure to threat. You simply tell, you've probably experienced it when you took your own boys to a party. Mm-hmm. They'll initially go away from your leg. They'll go into sort of forays and see who's around and see if they get one kind of happy face that they know or they recognise, they'll go out and spend a minute. But they'll still come back to you. So, is it safe? It's a constant, it's an early engram again that we have in our nervous system. And then they play it out. And you'll go, yes, they're okay, off you go. And then suddenly they don't need you anymore and you can go. But if you go a little bit too early, you've abandoned them. If you stay too long, you're overprotecting them. It's always a balance as a parent. It's a constant nightmare. But you're setting for that child a way of approaching the world to actually face chaos and giving them the skills to do it. Mm-hmm. So in general terms, most things are safe, and just be ready for the big ones, and these are them. Those are the ones, and kind of go and make the other mistakes, because although they might be unpleasant in some ways, they're not going to harm you. And just set them forward. And we see that, and the problem is we're living in the safest times possible, but we're bubble wrapping our children more than we've ever done. It's a paradox.
I completely agree. Actually, I had raising my children, I very much had that in mind, very strongly. And I have tried to create areas where they could roam around and build their resilience. And also I've installed a no-fuss policy at home. I don't do fuss. Is there a problem? We're going to fix it. Yeah. But if you're being fussy, go and talk to somebody else. Wrong person. Because I realized that our children, not just my children, all our children in the societies we live in right now, they do not face adversity.
No, that's right. And of course, a lot of immigrant populations have. So again, they come in and they bring their children. In fact, I saw a chap only today in clinic, interestingly, who's come from the Eastern Bloc, not Russia, but actually, and until he was 15, he was from that particular country, and then of course he went to Paris at 15, but literally had to become a different person because it's a different language, it's a different culture, etc. And he's an amazingly resilient chap as a result, because he's learnt those skills. He's learnt to move forward, that change isn't always a bad thing. It's scary to begin with, but you learn its ways and you get those skills and you park them and you bank them and you move on to the next thing. So going out into the world and facing them and grading your exposure to them is an entirely healthy thing to do. And of course, if you don't fear it, you don't get the inflammation. You don't get sick. You're not stressed by things. Stress is a response, an unusual response to something that you perceive to be dangerous. It's that simple. So if you don't perceive it to be dangerous, you don't get stressed.
It's subjective.
That's what resilience is.
Yeah.
And I think, and at the heart of that, if you aren't stressed for long enough because you're constantly fearful, then you don't get what we call sickness, stress sickness, which is they do actually ultimately become ill. They're not diseased, but they become ill. They get symptoms. They'll get spots, they'll get the rashes, they'll get the irritations, they'll get the sore joints, the achiness, the lack of sleep, irritable eyes, all those things we probably know about. My daughter's going through her exams. She wants desperate to get a first in her exams, etc. And she's greasy head and spotty and, just off at the world because she's having to sit there and work for hours. And she's stressed, but she'll come through it. And she knows that. I said, sometimes we just have to buckle down and do what we don't want to do.
Yeah,
that's what life's about.
A little bit of adversity is definitely good. So what would be your advice for people post-COVID experiencing all these symptoms? Because actually I have had many people come to me through the Eat, Burn, Sleep platform describing post-COVID, I'm feeling but I never caught the virus. Like, are you sure? Yes, I never tested positive for antibodies. So people who never caught the virus have described inflammatory symptoms, which you're explaining to us now exactly why, which is fascinating. So what kind of solutions could we offer them to help them reduce those symptoms?
I think it's to get a hack on it and get an angle on it and realize now I've explained the behavioral immune system. And don't forget, the important thing to remember is this is subconscious. This isn't you being silly, different, neurotic. It's subconscious to what it's a reflex that you are doing without thinking about it. So once you know about it and go, actually I am, I haven't really seen my friends as much and I'm missing that and I'm feeling a bit isolated and that's making me a bit stressed. And, we're not going to dinner parties and we're not going to the theatre. And it's like, because kind of everybody else isn't. It's like, well, how do you know that? How do you know everybody else isn't? And you go, oh, okay. Yeah, well, maybe they are. Maybe I should ask them. Yeah, maybe you should connect. And then you'll realize that actually everybody's been feeling the same way I did. I asked my wife that day, why don't we do dinner parties anymore? Have I upset everybody? Have I been cancel cultured? And she still went, well, no, we haven't been asked, but then we haven't had anybody. I said, no, have we got lazy? Is it apathetic? And actually the apathy is this reflex. You just don't know you're doing it. And you're worried about what other people are doing. So it sets up a whole element of involvement. Just connect with your friends. And by the way, this may sound controversial. I have to be very careful how I say it. Your immune system is a socially based system. You get a better immune system by being around other people. And that is why we had to separate each other when the pandemic was going around. Okay, because you spread it. And the biggest spreaders are our kids. Because they also don't behave like we do. Yeah, your kids go to school and they touch each other. They invade each other's space in a way that adults don't. And they modeled this out in America. In fact, Michael, we'll come to a minute, the financial writer, just done a very good book called Premonition, where this is what they actually found. They said when we watched kids, they interact in a way that adults don't, but that spreads disease and then they take it home. But during the pandemic, I found a piece of work that I think was absolutely seminal. It was a huge study, I think, of 20 or 12 million, I think it was, people. And they simply showed that if you were over 75 and you had kids, your grandchildren, you had a 43% protection from all disease, not just COVID, but included COVID, of not getting it. or having it very mildly because of your children.
Amazing.
So be around your children and stay around them. This is why doctors and why school teachers get sick very little. It's really true, because they're around the kids all the time. They're constantly being exposed to bugs, and those bugs raise one thing: your T cells.
Yeah.
Your T cells are the magic little people that walk around you, protecting you all day. And weirdly, and this sounds, it's extraordinary, but I happen to know that for hereditary reasons, I have a very high T cell count, particularly of CD8 and CD4. And I happened to mention it to a friend of mine at UC, at University College Hospital. And I said, yeah, well, of course, I just never get ill. I've never been to the doctor. He went, no, yeah, no. I said, no, really, I've never had a cold. And he said, we need to look at that. And they did, and they're off the charts. So they're now looking at why that is and whatever, and if they can use it for therapy and so on. But
amazing.
My point is that because the T cells are high, now the problem is that, of course, we are going to see a rebound this year of people getting all the other flus because they've been around it. They've been away from each other. And that will cause deaths. They won't be logged in the same way. And that's the problem. But I'm afraid people die every year of flu, and it's quite a lot of people. You're protected from it because it doesn't get into the news. But on a much more positive note, and again, when I was in primary care in Fulham, we'd see all the grannies coming in, and they'd go, coffee, flu, choky, whatever, for 6 weeks at the beginning of the winter. And then you didn't see them again. Because that infection had raised their T cells. It had unpleasant symptoms, of course, but their immune system had killed them off. T cells are back up. Kids keep bringing them more viruses. The T cells just get stronger, and they don't get the symptoms. So you will always see a patch of the older generation getting these things initially, and then you don't see them. And that's because their immune system's adapting. So we need to be back out there. We need to be brave. We're vaccinated, and now, luckily, COVID is a pretty mild disease. And actually, in fact, in the hospitals now, people are going in spite of COVID, they're going in with COVID in their system, but actually they're going in for completely separate reasons. So now things have kind of flipped. So this is really now a viral cold. And of course, we should worry about mutants. But if you go by the general rules of viruses, which is that they tend to, over a 3-year period, they get more transmissible. They're very clever. They get more able to spread themselves, but actually they get a lot less lethal and aggressive. And that's because evolution dictated it, that if you killed your host, you didn't get spread. It's that simple.
It's so interesting what you're saying, because when the pandemic happened and we went into lockdown, I kept thinking, and I couldn't help it, I kept thinking, this is going to weaken our immune system. I don't want to use these gels on my hand. It's killing the bacteria. And, each person does what they feel comfortable with in terms of risks. So I would never go and tell anybody to behave a certain way, but I was never the person who washed the vegetables. In fact, if anything, I was thinking I need to stay strong in my head and think that I'm healthy, that everything's fine, that even if I catch it, I will deal with it. I have a strong immune system. I was thinking I'm going to tap into neuroplasticity. And if I catch it, amazing, I'll have antibodies. But this is my approach. I'm not saying this can be controversial again, and I don't want people to say, but I've lost my grandmother. For sure, I would not go and, put your grandmother at risk. I didn't want to become bacteria-free. I didn't want to be freaking out unless it was something like the plague. I thought, okay, if we're at plague level, okay.
It's different.
It's different. And also what I knew during that time from all the messages I was receiving is how stressed people felt from the lack of social interactions,
yes,
which have been shown to be the number one factor for longevity. You're talking about immunology, but we know also from a mental standpoint, you feel needed when you see other people. You feel rewarded. Humans are social beings because ancestrally, if we were separated from the group, we died. So for us, there is nothing worse than being lonely. And if we're in fear because we're lonely and put, in lockdown, really, our immune system weakened. So we were it was so contradictory what was happening, because yes, we needed to be careful with the virus and all of that, but at the same time, there was a price to pay.
Oh, absolutely. And I think 2 points to raise there. One is, and I think the elderly are a very good description. I'm afraid in the West we tend to dump our elderly. We leave them unattended. We put them in nursing homes, whatever. And of course, it's actually and there's huge amounts of studies. We saw this in Australia when I was working in gerontology. We saw that, isolation was the biggest cause of disease. They would literally give up. It's like the old elephant would go away and die in the graveyard if you put them away. But of course, the reason that so many old people died in nursing homes was because they're isolated. Then they're not getting the T cell count. So of course, as soon as this little blighter came along, they were going to be easy pickings, because unfortunately they hadn't got the high T cell count. They weren't interacting with people socially or physically. They're very often poorly nourished, believe it or not. They're just because their appetites are low. And this goes back to something that you obviously, from your point of view, is very important. But actually, one of the most major things you can do to support your T cell count is good food. Because we know, I was involved in a study down in Africa with HIV patients where we were giving them antivirals, and most of the locals wouldn't respond, and we couldn't understand why. They were resistant to taking this antiviral. And then we realized it wasn't. It's because they used to eat mealie meal, which is a very non-subsistence level ground up corn. Because they're very high levels of poverty down there. As soon as we brought them World Health Organization nutrification packs, nourishment packs, they literally exponentially responded. Just beautifully. Suddenly, their response just went up. The graph massively increased, simply because at the heart of a good immune system is your nutrition.
Okay, so here you're describing two things. The first one is the quality of your gut bacteria.
Yeah.
Dictates your nutrients absorption.
Yeah.
So if your gut bacteria is poor, you won't even absorb the medication, which is what you're describing. And the second thing is 70% of your immune system cells, GALT, gut-associated lymphoid tissue, sit in the gut.
Yeah.
So to improve your immune system, it is about food. Mm-hmm. It is about social interactions. Mm-hmm. And it is about your thoughts, because 60% of the neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, melatonin, GABA, is produced in the gut.
Well, it's also why you'll very often find that if you have ladies with eating disorders, for example, you will find, of course, their fertility will drop off. And the reason for that is very simple. If there wasn't enough food around for you, let alone food around to bring in a child into the world, your fertility just dropped.
Yeah.
And you very often find when their body fat just increases enough, there's a little tipping point, they will suddenly have babies. But it's, those things are always interrelating. And it's actually just also the nourishment itself, because the body had to have a hierarchical system of importance. It would sacrifice your immune system because your nervous system is actually what keeps you alive. So it would fuel and feed your nervous system because it had to sacrifice something, but you had to still be able to run away from anything you're going to be chased by. But equally, if you kept the nutrition back up, then the immune system would restore itself quite quickly. But it had to have a hierarchical system of importance.
What you're saying about fertility is so true. I would not conceive when I was at a certain low weight. Mm-hmm. It was only 2 kilos above that I become fertile. I know exactly which weight. My children, I noticed both of them conceived them quickly when I was at that weight. But I read a fascinating study actually about women in Japan who have lower body fat than women in the West. The reason for that is they have higher DHA levels, which DHA being the fish oil that supports brain and eye development in fetuses. Because they eat so much fish, they have higher DHA in their fat stores, so the body doesn't need to store as much fat for fertility.
Absolutely. I think it's also a less saturated fat too, so it's more readily mobilized, so the body can get hold of it much quicker. I think a lot of these are multifactorial reasons, but in general terms, you very often find that factors like this are really important and overriding over others. And of course, the other thing is that, very sadly, if you go to countries where there is high infection rates and malnourishment, then what happens is, sadly, it does rob from the nervous system. So we know it stops them developing IQ, which is quite interesting. So they can't make as many neurons. They haven't got the nutrients to make all the calcium, etc., necessary, and all the fat around the myelin sheaths, etc. So unfortunately, they sacrifice neurological development over their immune system being maintained, etc. So interestingly, it will maintain the ability to get away from people, but it won't increase your ability to think and to cogitate on things and look at complex ideas. So the most important thing is you need to keep maintaining both levels. So you need to. So if you actually look at children who got COVID in India, for example, where in fact they didn't have huge amounts of malnourishment, but were lean and skinny, and of course were around each other and high T cell counts. I mean, if you go and bathe in the Ganges, you're bathing in a soup, a petri dish of bugs. You and me would be down with hepatitis, everything, A, B, C, right through the alphabet. By coming down, we'd be on the ciprofloxacin in 5 minutes. These kids are drinking it, washing it, putting it over themselves, and of course they're immune to it all. And so they have these very high T cell counts. So for a lot of them, COVID, there weren't the number of deaths in India that we really expected. Of course, there was a huge amount of people, but per capita, actually not that many people died because they were slim and lean, which we knew affected people's outcome. They weren't actually malnourished, so they had good immune systems, and they had high exposure to nasty things in the first place. And they probably did, they don't wash their hands as much, etc. Mm-hmm. So I think, at many levels, we need to kind of rethink things. And they have high population density there, which is interesting. So it's not just about everybody being around each other. It's interactions, number of interactions, and so on. But I think we've never really faced a pandemic in our lifetime since the Spanish flu of 1918. And again, if you look at that time, they were very malnourished. They'd finished a war. All the men who'd come back were barely recovering. There'd been high levels of rationing, very poor protein supplementation in their food. And so when that virus came, it took out even more people because they just didn't have the ability to fight it off.
Because they were weak. So to go back on what you were saying, the first thing is when humans are malnourished, what the body does is work on the immune system, which is necessary to be kept alive, but then it's going to be at the expense of the brain development.
Other things, exactly.
Yes, because you don't need that to stay alive.
Prioritizes. Exactly.
You need your immune system first. You don't need a very high IQ to stay alive immediately.
Exactly.
And the second thing that you're talking about is the fact that basically we've become too clean.
I think so, absolutely. And this goes back to the gut bacteria. I mean, there's some marvelous work being done that I'm looking at the moment with a very influential professor of anthropological sort of gut. He's actually an anthropological by microbiologist. They're a very small section of the population, but his stuff is fascinating about, believe it or not, even why the anus and the vagina are so close together is because there is actually a transmission of bacteria, which well known. We see this in animals as well. Of mother to child.
That's
and those
right.
bacteria make their way in, etc. So it all sounds disgusting, but actually is a fundamental part of the mother's preparation of the child for the world, and that's what you've got to get them out. And this is why swaddling children and overprotecting them doesn't work. You want them to be exposed, and that forms a foundation to their immune system.
Yeah.
There's one more. I feel this is another little nugget that I discovered, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and I couldn't believe it was true until I read the data, but it's actually interesting that you can predict higher levels or different levels of infection rate in people according to their political bias. And I went, yeah, right, of course you can. I mean, if you're a raging conservative, and it's interesting, they're absolutely right. And so if you take conservatives on one hand and you take liberals on the other, which one do you think are going to have a higher rate of infection?
Conservatives.
Absolutely right.
Because they don't go out as much.
You see, most people will say liberals because they go out and they mix with people. No, it's the opposite. Because they mix with people, they're better protected because they're more interested in new ideas, new things, new concepts, new tastes, flavours, etc. That's what liberalism is, okay, in its widest terms. Conservatism is the Telegraph reading, Shire living, people with small sections of friends who are not quite neophobic. They don't like new ideas or things. And therefore they stay in things. So it's quite tribal. It's based around, and this is what we do find in tribal situations, they do get sicker because actually they stay in the groups. And it's the stranger that brings in the bug. They never develop enough exposure that they really ever get immune to it. So it's really interesting. So you can literally correlate, and it's been done in a 30-year study done by one man, poor chap, who's given his life to it, but it is quite interesting. So you can see how behavioural patterns, attitudes, psychological profiles, etc., can actually lead to infection, immunity, and things. And this is what we've got to do. We've got to be able to learn to link all this stuff because it gives you a much better insight in how to run the world, really, and give really good advice, because every day in the newspapers you're being given confliction. Drinking's good for you. No, it's not. Black chocolate's really good for you. No, it's not. Nobody knows what to think all the time.
Well, because they don't look at the small print, if I may say so. So in a nutshell, what you're telling us is being social, seeing people is good for your immune system. It's good for you mentally. It's good for you immunologically. It's good for your gut bacteria. And when it comes to drinking, I love that you're mentioning this, because on the platform, people are allowed to drink. And one of the main reasons why I have allowed alcohol is because I do not want people to stop having social interactions.
100%. I think you do everything. My granny used to say, everything in moderation. If you drink too much, it's trouble. If you drink sort of fairly regularly and little, and you'd use it to around social, never drink on your own. Again, I find that's a rule I've always had. If you're drinking on your own, you've got a problem.
That's right.
Always drink for it to be a social adjustment. And in this country, we can have a tendency to just have a drinking culture. Without, if you're not blotto, you haven't had a good time. Whereas in Italy, it's fascinating. They can quite happily have a glass of wine with their sandwich at lunchtime and return to work and feel very, very few side effects, but have enjoyed the whole process and taste and flavour. And they will probably have done it in a collegiate way with a colleague having a nice lunch. So they're sharing the effects of all of that together in a communion way. And I think that's what we tend to forget. Quick in, get lunch, get this. And if I'm going out, I'm just going to get off my head, because that's the only thing that we've learned to do. Suffer with the outcome in the morning.
Yeah, very good point. And one more thing that you mentioned, which is not to do with the topic of the podcast today, but I just want to mention it. When you were saying that the anus is very close to the vagina for contamination, that's why babies face towards the backside when they come out.
In a perfect presentation, absolutely.
Yeah. So their mouth literally is in contact with the mother's gastrointestinal tract. And that's why when I have ladies who start the lifestyle when trying for a baby or during pregnancy, I say it's amazing. If you strengthen your gut bacteria, you're making your baby a favor.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's been shown that babies inherit a mom's microbiome even when they're born by C-section, because we have bacteria on our skin, we have bacteria in the air that we breathe out, we have something called a holobiome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've noticed that in families, people have similar body types because they share the same bacteria.
Absolutely. And hormonal transference to it too. So you're picking up constantly. People say, I can smell fear. Well, you can. You can't directly smell it. It's a subconscious thing. But you can pick up very quickly from people. So we're communicating all the time, subliminally as well as actively through speaking in sight and gestures in a way that we don't. And if you're doing that through electronics, you're just not getting it. Go and see people, be with them, exchange everything that it is to be in communion with another person. And it's magical, and it's bound us together for millions of years, but we really have separated from each other, and it's at the heart of a lot of the problems that we're talking about.
Thank you so much, Nick. This was so insightful.
My absolute pleasure.
And those words to finish the podcast are perfect. Be social.
100%.
See people. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your physical health. It's good for your immune system. It's great for your gut bacteria. Get out there and enjoy.
And it'll take your inflammation down. That's real.
Yeah. Laughing, seeing people reduces your chronic inflammation. Thank you so much, Nick. For all our listeners, if you want to read Nick's book, it's The Meaning of Pain, available on Amazon, translated in many languages, Nick?
It is quite about 6 now. I'm lucky to have found out, but it's funny. I can't read it in those languages. I hope the translation's good.
In which languages is it available?
We've got Polish, French, Russian, German, and Thai, of all things, which is lovely. So the people in Thailand, I hope they're enjoying it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. To all of you listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it, rate it, and see you next time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this uplifting recovery story. It is quite amazing how the power of the mind is so decisive when it comes to health. But the power of making the right choices is very important as well. So with that in mind, I've created a cancer recovery section, which is now part of the specialized advice section, included in the premium membership of the Eat Burn Sleep platform. If you are a member, I advise you to go and have a read. It's very educative. It is important to understand how cancer works for prevention purposes. And if you are going yourself through cancer, I advise you as well to go and check it out. I give you nutrition advice, mental wellness advice, lifestyle advice, as well as supplements advice to support you best through this difficult time. Keep smiling, keep healthy, and thank you so much for listening.